My name is Jerry Langer, and I'm the chair of the Adult Education American Jerusalem Academy at the Highland Park Conservative Temple and Center Congregation Anshe Emet. And although I didn't arrange for this program, I'm absolutely thrilled to have been asked to moderate it. So let me set up one or two protocols and let people know how we're going to do this. I'm going to since people can come in without being allowed in, so I don't have to worry about that aspect. I'm going to monitor the chat. So people who have questions for Rabbi Kahn-Troster should please use, for those in the center of the lower panel of your screen, there will be a button that says chat. And if you press on that, it'll bring up a field to the right of your screen. And you can type in a chat, and you can type in a comment or a question. And there's a pull down above where it says type message here. It says to, and there's a pull down menu. You can send that comment or question to everyone who's on the call, or you can send it, for instance, to me. Please don't send it to our speaker. She has her own responsibility here, which is to present, she doesn't need the responsibility of having to read what's going on, what's scrolling along the right side of her screen. So please send it either to me or to send it to everyone. Some of the comments or questions, I may hopefully politely interrupt her as in real time to get it out if I think it's advisable, and if not, I'll hold it for the end. Okay. So that being said, I'd also like to. Pardon? Are people getting an echo, by the way, from me when they listen to me? Okay, because my wife is on a different line. And sometimes when you have two lines in the same household, you get the echo. But I think it's because I'm host, I'm on actually a different line. So I'd like, before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Elliot Malamet, who's the rabbi of the Highland Park Conservative Temple. Rabbi, if you can unmute yourself and say hi, or.
I just want to say shalom, everyone. Good to see you all. And it's in a very important subject that we are going to discuss. I look forward to hearing what my colleague, Rabbi Rachel Kahn-Troster, has to say. Of course, it's not the first time that we've welcomed her to the shul. This is the first time we welcomed her virtually, but also it would be remiss for me not to say that I knew her parents. And the connection in Canada when I was a student. So
another Canadian.
Yeah, it happens when you're around with kids. So thank you.
There you go. So good to see you again.
And one other introduction I'd like to make is Stu Feinblatt, who is the president of the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshe Emet. Stu, you want to say hi?
Say hello to everybody. It's great to see so many people for this important program, and it looks like we're almost up to 100. This is really phenomenal, and a lot of fresh faces tonight, so please enjoy the program. Thank you, Jerry, for moderating, and welcome, Rabbi.
So I'd like to, thanks, Stu. So let me just put in my 2 bits before Rabbi Kahn-Troster begins. So this week's Torah portion, Deuteronomy or Devarim, is the beginning of Moshe's address to the Israelites. So he and the children of Israel, to set the scene, are on the eastern side of the Jordan where Moses will die. Except for Joshua and Caleb, the people he addresses were not born into slavery. The people are the children or grandchildren of the Israelites who came out of Egypt. And our narrative is that the children went from slavery to freedom, and those who were entering the promised land were entering as born into freedom, albeit in transit in the wilderness. And as free people, they were being prepared to conquer the land and to build a new civilization in the promised land. But the narrative of slavery to freedom, ownership of the land, and the ability to create a new reality was not to be the experience of the large majority of enslaved African Americans and their descendants following their formal release from slavery. Both formal and informal shackles have persisted in countless forms into the 21st century, more than 150 years beyond the formal end of slavery in America. And this is one part of the unfinished business of American history. With that said, I'd like to introduce our presenter tonight. So Rabbi Rachel Kahn-Troster is Deputy Director of Teruah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, where she is the lead strategist on Teruah's human rights campaigns and heads the organizing and training of more than 2,000 rabbis and cantors. Ordained in 2008 from the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she was a student activist and leader, she's a noted speaker and writer on Judaism and human rights. She first came to Teruah in 2007 to organize against US-sponsored torture in the War on Terror. Since then, she's initiated campaigns against human trafficking, which goes on, and forced labor, to end solitary confinement and to fight against mass incarceration. She's the original tomato rabbi, spearheading Teruah's critical partnership with the coalition of Immokalee workers in Florida. That was about the tomato harvesters, and leads Jewish community in worker-led campaigns for corporate accountability. Rabbi Kahn-Troster serves on the board of the Alliance for Fair Food and is vice chair of the board of the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. She lives in our neighboring town of Teaneck up the road with her husband, Dr. Paul Pelovin, and their daughters, Leora and Eliza. And with that, Dr. Kahn-Troster, please take it away.
Thank you, and thank you so much for including me. This is, I think, my second time speaking to your community, although last time I was in person. I think that was in 2016 or 2017. And I, of course, attended your congregation when I was in USY because when I was in Hagalil in the mid-1990s. So it's always really great to come back to this community and to be part of your conversation. And I actually wanted to start off by thanking you for having me, not just because I think this is an important conversation, but to make to really tell you that this is a really tremendous moment of change and possibility. Sometimes, it may be a cliche to Reverend Martin Luther King saying that the arc of the universe is only justice. But I think through my work in the Jewish community over the past 13 years, I've seen situations where change feels like it's possible. And the Jewish community in general is speaking up for Black Lives Matter and speaking up on this issue and having many more internal conversations than we did when the last time when this issue really came to the forefront in 2014 and 2015. And I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation together. So I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then I'm going to open up the floor to questions. I've been given a few topics to hit on during our conversation, but I'm also open to continuing those conversations when I open for questions. So just for those of you who don't know Teruah, I would like to give you just a little bit of background about who we are. Teruah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, is an organization of more than 2,000 rabbis and cantors from across all streams of Judaism, and together with all members of the Jewish community, we act on the Jewish imperative to respect and advance the human rights of all people. We're grounded in Torah and our Jewish historical experience, and we're guided by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we call upon Jews to assert Jewish values by raising our voices and taking concrete steps to protect and expand human rights in North America and Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And we do that in three ways. We organize rabbis and cantors and their communities to make an impact through specific human rights campaigns. We train the next generation of rabbis and cantors to be human rights leaders. and we amplify the voices of rabbis and cantors on the most pressing human rights concerns of our time. And our work on Black Lives Matter really comes out of both our work on ending mass incarceration and the reality that we believe that rabbis and cantors in the Jewish community should speak up on human rights and moral concerns. In our statement that we issued after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, we quoted two Jewish texts, one of which was new to me and one of which is one of my guiding principles. So the one that was one of my guiding principles is from the Talmud and Ta'anit. And it says, when the community is immersed in suffering, a person may not say, I will go to my home and I will eat and drink and peace be upon you, my soul. So the idea that like when the community is suffering, when people are taken to the streets, we don't have the option of doing nothing. We don't have the option of saying, everything is fine, I'll just go home and be part of my life. And I think it is, for me, it has been critically important that when people are suffering and when their calls to action are happening, that we be part of that, not just because we're modern moral people, but because we're Jews. And the second is that it was a text from the Mechalta de Rabbi Ishmael on the Parshat Bachodesh, and it said, how are the 10 commandments arranged? 5 on one tablet and 5 on the other. On one tablet is written, I am the eternal your God, and opposite it on the other tablet is written, you shall not murder. This means that one who sheds blood is considered as having diminished the divine image, right? So the idea that every human being is created in the image of God is not just a sentiment that happens out there, but it's really based on the understanding that like then we take a life, we diminish God's image. As a human rights activist, one of the hardest things I have to teach people, and this is, I think, coming to understand this is behind so much of the work we all have to do to build a just world and to understand that some of us benefit in this world more than others, is the idea that human rights and every human being being created in the image of God are the floor and not the ceiling. I think especially as Americans, we talk about rights as something we aspire to. And then we use that to judge other people. You know, well, maybe their actions weren't right. Why did they resist? You know, how do we not, you know, if they only did the right things or acted the right way, then yeah, of course, then they would get rights. But why are they protesting and why are they angry? And actually, human rights are the floor. Every single one of us is deserving of rights. Every single one of us has rights. But some of us have more access to them than others. But if we actually acted as though every human being was created in the image of God, and that was the basis for human behavior rather than something we all aspired to, I think it would change the way we all acted. So as I mentioned, part of what TRA does and part of what I've done has been working on ending mass incarceration. And that's how I found myself in, you know, the last sort of touch point for the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. TRA's work on ending solitary confinement had become a campaign to end mass incarceration. And as part of that, we knew we were going to have to talk about the role of the police. And that was something that I think I was coming to understand as a piece of understand what it meant to be Jewish, but also to be white. For me, a really key moment in understanding why my experience might be different and to think of that differently, that Jews might have privilege as people who were white or people who, you know, had functional whiteness, was when a friend of mine who was himself white and Jewish and is a longtime friend of mine and is raising 2 children who were born in Ethiopia, said to me after the death of Trayvon Martin, he said, my Jewish friends don't understand that I cannot give my son all of my white privilege. And I sat with that for a long time. I've told him subsequently that he made me think, because I think until he said that, I hadn't really thought about it. And here it was, I was a social justice activist. Of course I should have thought about it, but I really didn't. You know, the idea that I just thought if we raised people, you know, in Jewish communities, that everyone would be treated equally and that they would have the same access and the same rights, but it isn't true. When my friend's son leaves the house, that's not how the world sees him. And that's not how he experiences society. And it was with that in my head that I went to Ferguson after the death of Michael Brown. When the Jewish community began protesting and when the Black Lives Matter movement, which had started in San Francisco, really came to the forefront. And I was brought there by a rabbi named Rabbi Susan Talvey, who had really been involved with the front lines of the protest movements. And she said, you know, we have an obligation to be here. You know, we have an obligation to show up and say that Black Lives Matter and that it's important for us to show up as Jews. And from that, TRA really began to engage with, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement as part of saying, like, this is what the Jewish community has to say. And it was interesting for me that I think that was very hard for us to say in that moment. It's not quite as hard now. Like, why is it that if we believe that every human being is in the image, created in the image of God, that it's important to actually state that some lives matter. And that's because we live in a society where often Black lives are not treated as though they matter, where we still have significant systemic racism. And for Jews for whom our whiteness feels conditional, right, given the rise of anti-Semitism, for many of us whose grandparents or parents or ourselves may not have grown up thinking of ourselves as white, to understand that for white Jews, and obviously the entire Jewish community is not white, and we'll talk about that a little bit more too, to actually understand that we have access to white privilege and that we function as white in society has been really hard, I think, for us to deal with, and to understand that the anti-Semitism we may face is different than the systemic racism that's built into American society because of the experience of slavery and the ongoing legacy of slavery, first with Jim Crow and then with ending mass incarceration, which targeted communities of color. And the process of learning that, I would say, is a constant process. At Truah, we like to say we are doing the work of becoming an anti-racist organization, but it requires constantly not just learning, right? Like, I think it's not just about reading the right books and having the right conversations, although that's really important, but it's also about thinking about what is the work we need to continue to undo, both to unlearn our own biases and to repair the harm. I think for the Jewish community, there's a number of things in particular we have to confront. I remember, I would say this was like the year 2000. A friend of mine who is now also a rabbi had been to Germany as part of a trip organized by the German community to bring Jews to Germany to talk about the Holocaust and to meet with young Germans who were confronting the Holocaust. And my friend said, young Germans have thought a lot more about the Holocaust than I've thought about slavery. And I thought that was a great comment, and I repeated that to a few people, and some people said, well, why does it matter? Our families weren't here during slavery. And I had to learn to say, well, yes, but we still benefit from the results of slavery, from the stratification of American society, from the lack of generational wealth that has accumulated to has not accumulated to African Americans because of the experience of slavery. And when we think about that after the Civil War, there were calls for reparations for slave owners for the property they lost, but the people of color were never compensated for having built the nation through our labor, and that those biases continue to this day. I think understanding systemic racism has been really important to understand why for Jews, because we didn't know how to see it, we just thought, well, if you work hard in this country, because that was our family's experiences, that you will get ahead. Why cannot they get ahead? That's why one article I would really recommend to people, and that was eye-opening for me, and I think really speaks to the Jewish community, is Ta-Nehisi Coates' article from, again, 2016, called The Case for Reparations. And it was really the first mainstream article talking about why we needed to pay reparations to the African American community for the experience of slavery. And the reason I think it's particularly a great article for Jews to read is because it talks about the GI Bill. I remember the first time I learned that the GI Bill was a negative thing for some communities. For many people in Jewish communities, the GI Bill was how we became successful in America. After the Second World War, people came back from the war, they got educations through the GI Bill, they were able to buy homes, right? We know a lot that the ability to buy property is important to building generational wealth, which is different than income. And it's part of our success story as a Jewish people, for those of us whose families were here in the 40s and 50s. But the African Americans who came back from the war were largely excluded from the GI Bill. I was an adult, like pretty far along. Like I think I'd probably been working for Truah for 5 or 6 years before I knew that. So here was a story that was so useful for I'm Canadian, but like for many American families, yet could also be a navigative story for other people in this country. I think that was really important for me to unlearn. The reason we also have to think, I would say, about Jews, about our own whiteness, is because our own whiteness means that for those of us who are white Jews, is that it also means that our institutions are predominantly white institutions. And in this moment of saying Black Lives Matter, we have to look at our own institutions and think about what are the ways in which that we are making our spaces welcoming to Jews of color, that we make assumptions that people of color are not Jewish necessarily, that things that we treat as good in the Jewish community largely may not be. Like, I remember I was talking with the head of the Jewish day school where my children go, who's really great, and he had been sent an article by a number of Jewish day school alumni that had been published, I think, in the foreword, that talked about, among the things they were saying they had never learned in day school, these were yeshiva high school grads, was that, you know, they said the school treats school security as a good, and yet for many Jews, especially Jews of color, but also transgender Jews, or, you know, or Jews who are poor, you know, the experience of having shul security is a negative. They get questioned, they get stopped, their presence in the synagogue is not seen as a given. It's because of the color of their skin or their outward appearance. So at this time when I think we especially feel vulnerable in our Jewish institutions and we are putting up more security, what does the conversation around security mean about how we are welcoming? How do we think about, you know, when we look at our own institutions, how do we actually not say, there was a synagogue in Brooklyn, now true, it's in Brooklyn, but I thought they handled this really well. They said, we didn't want to just be welcoming of all people, we wanted to be made up of all people. So how do we look at our Jewish institutions and make sure they're not just welcoming, but made up of everyone, especially as the Jewish community diversifies? One question that I was asked was, why does it matter that we ourselves are not racist? I was definitely raised in the era of like where we were taught to be colorblind, right? You know, the idea that it was good if we just didn't see race. And we've learned over time that that actually was a really not helpful framework, because if you teach children not to see race and they look around the world and they see that people are treated differently based on their race, they wonder what the difference is between what they're being told and how people's lived experiences are. It also tells people that their lived experiences aren't valid. And finally, it also says that race isn't something we should be proud of. Like if you are, you know, if you know that being African-American is not something you should be proud of, being Hispanic, you know, or being Asian is not something you should be proud of. And so learning, first of all, to unpack our assumptions about, you know, how we construct the world, what does it mean to be a good person, is important. I think it's also not enough to just not be racist, because it's not just about our individual behaviors. Yes, we shouldn't be racist and we should call out our friends when they do things that are racist, but given that we may not be personally racist, but we may benefit from a system that is racially biased and has systemic racism, we need to actively work to dismantle it, right? So it's not just that I can say, you know, here in New Jersey, for example, we know that, right, we live in a very, very diverse state, and we are very racially segregated in where we live, right? And the fact that we have local control means that, you know, often our schools are very segregated based on the racial makeup of our town. And that language around like schools, like good schools, is often coded language for racial behavior. So like if I live in northern New Jersey, and I need to be aware of those systems and think about how both I as an individual and the Jewish community interacts with that problem, even as I'm saying to myself, how do I unpack my own racial bias? And so I just don't think it's enough to say that these are about my individual actions. It's really about how do we deal with those systems like voter suppression that are also upholding racism. The commentator Jay Smooth has a TED talk where he talks about, this is going to be trite, but I actually think it's really helpful. He talks about racism as like undoing racism or unpacking our own racial bias as being something like brushing your teeth, right? You don't brush your teeth once and then you're done for forever. Fighting your own internal racism and unpacking your own internal biases and working to make the system builder is like, you have to do it every day. And I think about that sometimes, especially, you know, when it feels like a lot, that this is not a one-time act. This is an ongoing action that I just have to incorporate into my life. And some days it's easier than others. One question that I got was, what are we to make of anti-Israel sentiment within the Black Lives Matter movement? So I'm going to start off by saying that how you answer that question is also going to depend on how you define anti-Israel, right? You know, I work for an organization that is part of, you know, we are a pro-two-state solution organization that is on the left, Israel-Palestine. And so we reject the idea that any criticism of the state of Israel and its treatment of the Palestinians is inherently anti-Israel. If you disagree with that, you are going to find the Black Lives Matter movement and left-wing movements in general more anti-Israel. So I will take as a given that criticizing the state of Israel and its treatment of the Palestinians is not an anti-Israel statement. So with that as a given, I would say that it's not unreasonable. First of all, it's not unreasonable that there would be solidarity between Palestinians and people of color in the United States. When I was in Ferguson, some of the first people to show up in support of the protesters were the Palestinians. There has really been a cross-movement solidarity, and we as Jews spend a lot of time saying, well, we aren't going to show up in your coalition unless you agree with us on Israel, and that means we're not present in a lot of spaces. No one would say, I shouldn't work with the National Council of the National Council of Catholic Bishops on immigration, an issue in which they've been really good, because I disagree with them on abortion. I'm not going to work with them on abortion and reproductive justice, but I am going to work with them on immigration. So we have to be willing to be in coalitions with people we disagree with. Secondly, we should make sure that before we start saying we will not work with you because on the left because of views you hold, that we also hold our right-wing coalition partners to the same standards. Certainly, we don't call out people in the Jewish community to the same degree who make racist statements, or Jewish politicians necessarily to the same degree. I would also say that it's really important to distinguish between what is anti-Semitic and what is anti-Israel, right? It is true, one of the major ones that we've heard through the Black Lives Matter movement is the idea of Israeli training of American cops, right? So it is true, and this is something we're often proud of in the Jewish community, that there have been exchanges between American law enforcement and Israeli law enforcement. So that is not true. To say that all American police brutality is the fault of the Israelis, that's anti-Semitic. And so it's important to call that out while still being willing to engage with people who are criticizing the actions of the Israeli government. And I think that's an important thing. And also, the final thing I would say is, if we're not in coalitions with people who make us uncomfortable, we may not be in the right coalitions. We're never going to have perfect unity with everybody. Reverend Tracy Blackman, who's from Ferguson, I'm always quoting her wrong, but she said that there's 3 types of people you work in coalitions with. There are the people who you are for the same things, but you're not necessarily against the same things, and you do some kind of coalition work with them. Then there are people who you're against the same things, but you're not necessarily for the same things, and you work in different coalitions with them. And then there are people with whom you're aligned on everything, and they're going to be a much smaller group of people, and you'll be in an accountable relationship with them, but that's not going to be everybody. But you have to be able to work with all 3 types of people in movements for change. So I want to leave a lot of time for questions, but I wanted to touch base on one thing. There's a text that I'm going to put it in chat. It was written in 2015 by Rabbi Susan Talvey, who, as I mentioned, is in St. Louis, and also by Sarah Barish, who was a rabbinical student at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical School. And it's their 10 rules for the Jewish community for showing up for Black Lives Matter. And when the protests around George Floyd broke out, I went back and looked at it. I found it really still relevant, and so I thought I'd just go through it, some of which I've already touched on. I would also say my personal connection to the George Floyd protest, which also is going to relate to the first thing I mentioned, is that I think, as was mentioned before, this is a national movement, but it also takes place differently in different ways. And one of my coalition partners through the work I do on worker organizing is a worker organization in Minneapolis whose offices are a block from where George Floyd was killed. And they were very involved. The area around where he was killed was shut down. And so they were organizing grocery deliveries for families and protest gear and all of that stuff. And I came back online after Shabbat, that weekend of Memorial Day, to see all the protests. And all I knew how to do was write them, and they said, and say, well, what do we do, right? Because in that moment, it wasn't about what my views, it was just about how do we support the community that's in pain? And they said, have your people call the Minnesota Attorney General and demand an independent investigation. And that's what we did. And so at that moment, the way we showed up as a Jewish community was by listening to the community that was most affected and working to support their change. And that's really important. So what are the rules for the Jewish community for getting involved in Black Lives Matter? The first is to show up. That may sound really obvious, but it's actually really true. The way you get involved is you show up, and you keep showing up. it's never too late to build relationships, because if you build relationships and you do the work of justice now, God forbid something happens, you'll be in relationships with people who can help your community through it. But it's never too late to start. The second is to practice listening and less talking. As a Jewish community, we're used to being the experts, and we're used to being in the lead. And when we are allies in a movement, which we might be if we're white Jews and for Black Lives Matter, our time is to listen, and this is a time for us to listen and to hear and to not invalidate what we're hearing just because it's not our own experience. We also have to respect the experiences of the people who are telling us this, whether they are, I think there was an article in the New York Times recently that mostly quoted experts and didn't quote people who were affected. Because I think we're used to listening to people with fancy degrees. I have fancy degrees, I would know, but it's more important to listen to the people whose experiences are at the center of what we're talking about. And that's very important for showing up for Black Lives Matter. The third is to do your own community's internal work, which is what you're doing right now, right? To have conversations, to think about what you need to learn, to figure out what the Torah of this work is for you as a community, and to listen to people of color and then also process it yourselves. Like there are spaces, a lot of times people have affinity groups for white Jews and Jews of color, and to think about what's the internal work you need to do as a community and to keep doing it. Which leads to the fourth piece, which is deal with the myth that all Jews are white. The American Jewish community is about 80% Ashkenazi. I also should point out that not all, there are Jews of color who are Ashkenazi. So I don't want to make a distinction, but that Sephardic Jews are Jews of color and Ashkenazi Jews are all white. But if we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we really have to talk about it as meaning that Black Jews matter. When you mean Jews, when you mean white Jews, don't just say Jews. I know I've probably been guilty of that a few times because this is an ongoing piece of work I'm trying to do. Think about how to make Jewish spaces welcoming to Jews of color. Think about the messages you send to your children around who is a Jew. I mean, we've talked a lot in my family around two things. What do we mean by looks Jewish? And what do we mean by a Jewish name? And those are really, especially in today's Jewish community, those are very complicated things to talk about. And I think that's really important. And we need to diversify our imagery to make sure they show Jews of color. Include a statement about, my synagogue in Teaneck has done a lot of work, for example, on LGBTQ inclusion, even though we don't have a lot of LGBTQ Jews who are members of the synagogue. And we can also do that about race in our Jewish communities. We don't have to wait for Jews of color to ask to be part of our Jewish institutions before we engage with diversity, because they may not come to our institutions if we haven't already had those conversations. I think that's really, really, really important. And there are other ways to do it too. Who are the people we quote in our sermons? Do we quote Jews of color? Do we bring in Jewish artists or Jewish musicians who are Jews of color? There are lots of different ways to do this. Find your Fergusons, which means, this was from 2014 when a lot of people were like, great, we're gonna go to where the protests are. And this time around, for better or for worse, the protests are everywhere. Do this work locally. You don't have to go to where it's flashy to do the work, but do this work locally. I remember after, in 2017, when this is slightly different, but when President Trump announced the Muslim ban, my favorite protest was the one I went to in my town, right? Rather than the big one in New York. And, largely because of social distancing, in the current wave of Black Lives Matter protests, I haven't gone into New York City, but I was part of one protest in Teaneck and two in Hackensack. And that made me feel really good to be able to be part of people standing up in my community to talk about change there. Hold yourself accountable, which means don't just say what other organizations are doing, but also think about how your community is hiring people of color. Think about how issues of living wage, at Trua, we are, for example, we don't post job, we look at racial equity issues constantly, like, are we posting salaries with job descriptions? Practice saying Black Lives Matter. Until we can all say it without caveats, we have a lot of work to do. Definitely hold the police accountable. There's a lot of conversation around defund the police, but the conversation around defund the police is inherently and I would also say the conversation around abolish ICE is similar. It's inherently a conversation about how do we spend our community's dollars? Are we can we divest from instruments of state violence and invest in our communities in healthcare and schools? We do have enough money to pay for this, if we're not invested so much in instruments of the police. Lobby for policy change. Policy change is important. Governor Murphy has been pretty open, not perfect, but definitely open to change on these issues. I was certainly part of a really important criminal justice campaign last year that had us end solitary confinement in New Jersey. I think we are very lucky in New Jersey that we have a governor who seems at least willing to have these conversations. And if we can't have change on a local level, we can have, on a national level, we can have change on a local level. 9, I have 2 more. Use your privilege to amplify the voices of people who have less privilege. So if you have a platform, it's not always important to say what you think. It's important to amplify people who don't have that platform. So like, you know, this is small, but I'm on Twitter. I'm less likely to put forward my own views on things. And I've been trying to amplify the voices of Jews of color who may or may not have the platform that I have, and introducing them to my white Jewish community. And go outside your comfort zone. Be willing to be called out. Be willing to try things that are hard. Be willing to hear things that are hard to hear. I'm constantly doing that. And it makes me sit and think like, okay, this is a story I didn't understand. The book I always tell people to read about racism is, which is staring at me from my bookshelf here in Teaneck, is Isabella Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about the Great Migration. Not only is it a great book, but like I had to really think about what it meant. Like it untold part of the story I knew about the world that I live in. And that was hard to sit with for a while. But it's when we feel uncomfortable and we unpack the world we thought we knew that it allows us the space to have kind of new worlds and new conversations rather than closing things off. So those are the rules that I would pass on to all of you. I've put it in chat. And with that, I am going to stop talking since that was one of my rules, and take some questions and see how people are doing. I know that this is a lot, and I really appreciate the chance to have a conversation.
So please put questions into your chat box, which is in the lower center of your screen. Let me start off while people are typing away with one. So some people, as they, over the last several weeks, some of the comments I've seen in the Jewish community are, well, there's a formal Black Lives Moment organization about which some people have reservations, and they distinguish that between a broad-based Black Lives movement, which is more focused, seemingly, on the agenda of anti-racism and the betterment of the Black community, and bringing the Black community into what might be considered a normalized relationship with the other communities in the United States. Do you have any feeling about sort of this distinction that some people, at least I see in the Jewish press, are making?
So there's a couple of different organizations. There's the Black Lives Matter movement, which was started in the Bay Area. There's actually, if any of you have the most recent New Yorker, they reprinted an article from 2016 about the roots of the Black Lives Matter movement in Oakland and how it intersected with the sort of Ferguson movement, and it's really worth reading, and also worth looking at 4 years later and seeing how many of those people are still national leaders. So there's the Black Lives Matter movement, then there's the movement for Black Lives. I think the reason why people often distinguish there is because the movement for Black Lives were the ones who put out the platform that created so much controversy in 2016 because its call for BDS and because of it referred to the situation of the Palestinians as a genocide. So I already want to distinguish there between the Black Lives Matter movement, often and then movement for Black Lives. And then there's the goals of the movement in general. If that is helpful for you, I mean, we don't make that distinction at Truab, but I think if that is helpful, the Black Lives Matter movement is also very grassroots. So there's lots of chapters around the country. They each have their own organizing structure and their own issues. What I would say is that if you are we wouldn't want the Jewish community held to a standard where, because of the views of one Jewish organization, no one would engage with our issues. And so I would say that that's not a standard we should hold the movement for Black Lives to as well. You know, and I think that's very important.
Oh, with this many smart people on this line, there must be other questions here. So, do you think there's a need to revisit social studies curriculum in the Jewish day schools to ensure that Black history is more deeply a part of American history?
I think so. I think that's part of, you know, I think that's part of our responsibility to educate our kids. You know, I think we're doing our kids a disservice also when we tell them a simple, you know, my kids are 10 and 12, so I've thought a lot about what we're teaching and then how we unteach things when they're older. And I think we do kids a disservice by not teaching them the complexity of the United States. So, you know, I think when we only teach about American history through its successes and not the problems we're grappling with, then our kids are like, why didn't you teach us this? I know at my school, I kind of yelled at them about like teaching Columbus, right? I was like, teaching Columbus Day, sorry, right? You have to teach about Thanksgiving, but you don't have to teach about Columbus Day, right? And, you know, because it's not a major holiday, and how would you, you know, then you have to unpack what you've taught like kindergarten kids about, you know, the fact that Columbus's heritage is, you know, complicated, you know, because of the way that Native American genocide happened. And I think that's true for American history as well, that it's better to teach a more complicated picture. And so the Jewish day schools have that obligation as well. We certainly need to think about how we teach American history in general. You know, I think, you know, one of the teachers at my kid's school reflected that she was horrified to learn that like the message that one of the kids had learned was that Martin Luther King Jr. ended racism, right? And so if that was what the kids were learning, then we had to go back and look at what we were teaching. And I think that's really important. People think my kids have been exposed to this a lot because it's like an agenda in my house, but I point out, you know, when your mother is a human rights activist, if you don't talk about human rights issues, then you can't talk about what you did during your day. But it's meant that we've had these conversations earlier than I think a lot of white Jewish families have. And there are ways to talk about it in ways that are age appropriate. And I think that's true for day schools as well. I certainly know that I've had to challenge my kids' day school on like what they think kids are able to hear. Which is, I think, important for us to really think that the ability, for example, to not talk with kids about racism is a sign of white privilege, right? Because parents of color and Black parents talk with their kids pretty early about it. And so I think for parents who are white and white Jewish, we have an obligation to talk about it early.
Let me take a couple of short ones, I think. Does the Black Lives Matter have leadership that might hone down the violent eruptions in some of the cities that are going on?
So the Black Lives Matter movement is a decentralized movement. I actually think that's really good. The Howard Zinn Education Project has a really amazing curriculum about how we teach Rosa Parks wrong. And I'm going to explain why that's important for us as Jews and how that relates to the Haggadah. So it says that when we teach Rosa Parks as an individual, or when we teach Martin Luther King Jr. as an individual, rather than seeing them as movement builders and as part of bigger movements, then we teach our kids, you have to be Rosa Parks or MLK to make a difference, right? One, we teach them you have to be leaders, and for white Jews showing up in the movement for Black lives, we kind of have to be followers. You know, this is a moment for us not to take the lead, but it also, like, we also have to teach people that you can just be an ordinary person in a movement for change. And I think about the fact that the Haggadah doesn't have Moshe in it, right? That when we get together as a Jewish community, I was thinking about this because I was writing a commentary on Devarim recently, just a quick overview, and like Devarim is all Moshe's story, right? It was like I was comparing it to Hamilton. You know, he's writing himself back into the narrative there. For those of you who are fans of the Hamilton musical, it is all about, Devarim is all Moshe taking over the narrative. That is not the story we tell at Pesach, right? The story we tell at Pesach is the collective story because we all have to be able to see ourselves as coming out of Egypt. And so movements for change need to do that too. We all have to feel like we're part of doing our part. I think, you know, the protests right now are really complicated. There's been significant attacks by violence by the police. I mean, we have clergy right now in Portland, or people, I know people who were in New York City who were just attacked by cops. it's really important to recognize that nonviolent protest, first of all, is confrontational, right? I think we think that nonviolent protest means that it's sort of peaceful protest standing on the side of the road, not bothering anyone. But nonviolent protest can be extremely confrontational. I mean, John Lewis, may he rest in peace, like when they marched across the Pettus Bridge, they were facing police violence, right? So nonviolent protest is as opposed to state violence. And we really have to examine the ways in which I think the state is reacting negatively to the protests that are happening right now. And that also that the violence has been a very small part of the protests, and in some cases it's been caused by outside agitators. I forget which city, I think it was Richmond, Virginia. I just saw a report that they showed that all the violence over the past weekend was caused by people coming in from the outside. And it still means we have to show up, because if we don't show up, then we will be letting the small part of the protest define our experience of it. I recognize that right now is a hard time to protest because of COVID-19, right? So I think there are other ways to take action. You know, we at TRUA have only been telling people to go to protests they feel comfortable going to. And that it's been really interesting for me to watch some of the rabbis who I view as my teachers in this work, choosing, you know, it's been really hard for them to not be at a protest because of their age, and they've been finding other ways to take action, either through social media or by amplifying the voices of others or going to socially distant protests. I know this is a more complicated time to say, like, take to the streets.
So another short one. There was a reference to a TED Talk. Can you repeat that?
Yes, it's by—
I actually missed that.
by the DJ and activist Jay Smooth, and I'll see if I can find it quickly. But it's really good. The other, actually, another, for those of you who are podcast fans, I'm going to recommend. This is what I'm listening to right now, so it's on my mind. 2 podcasts. One is called Uncivil, which unpacks sort of the stories we tell about the Civil War. And another is a great podcast out of the Center for Investigative Journalism at Duke called Scene on Radio. And the first season was on whiteness. The second season was on whiteness. The third one was on masculinity. And the fourth one, which I'm listening to right now, is about American democracy. And there's a professor at Rutgers named Chenjerai Kumanicha who is one of the co-hosts of the podcast, and it's really good.
Okay, you good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How do we balance having our discussions and lending our voices through a Jewish lens while ensuring that our predominantly Ashkenazi voices don't hijack the conversation?
So I think that this is a really hard question. I mean, I think one is that we need to actively try and elevate non-Ashkenazi and non-white Jewish voices. So like at TRUA, there are not a lot of rabbis who are Jews of color, and there's an even smaller number of rabbis who are Black. But when we've been getting speaking requests, we've been sort of passing them, especially paid ones, we've been passing them along. We can think about who we quote, right? And right now, I would say also that the speakers who are Jews of color are being asked to speak everywhere, which is great, but they're also a little overwhelmed, so they may take a while to get back to us. I think we also have to think about, is there a value in not saying something, right? Do we always have to weigh in? There was an article not about this that came out recently, and so many people weighed in on it in the Jewish community. I just thought maybe it might have been better just not to say anything, to say this is, you know, an important article. So I think like this need to respond to expertise with expertise is important, but to really also like think when do I need to take a step back? You know, we do that as teachers, right? That we know that if all we do is talk, we never leave space for our students. We have to do that as leaders too. It just may mean pulling ourselves back and saying, okay, maybe I will, instead of writing my own article, I'll reprint or pass around or share something someone else wrote. And I think that's hard when we are used to getting, for those of us with platforms, when we're used to getting our voices heard, but pulling back is really key.
Thank you. And how do we distinguish Jewish white privilege from white privilege in general? Or I guess, do we?
I don't know that we can, because I think not all Jews, not all Jews are white. So white privilege is like it intersects with issues of being Jewish. I think for many Jews, we feel, you know, I think we feel that our whiteness is somewhat conditional. So maybe it's like a functional privilege rather than a privilege we have that's sort of secure the way that it might be for other white Americans. Thinking of ourselves as white is like a really interesting conversation. It's partly generational. I don't like to say that every issue is generational, because I've found in my work on justice over the years that is not true, right? You have people who are older who are very progressive. You sometimes have people who are younger who are less progressive. I do find that the conversation around whiteness in the Jewish community tends to be more generational, because people who are white Jews who are younger are more likely to sort of have not thought about the fact that they were white and not thought that it was conditional, whereas Jews who might be older, white Jews who might be older, probably have lived through more of a direct experience prior to the past few years of direct anti-Semitism. They have more family stories of experiencing anti-Semitism here in the United States that was more structural. So it's just an ongoing conversation.
I'm going to go back a little bit. So here's an interesting one. I'm just going to give it as entered. Please ask if you agree with the portrayal of Jews as oppressors with regard to Black Lives Movement.
I don't think that
Black Lives Matter.
I think that, every movement has people who are anti-Semitic, and I think, I've been sitting a lot with James Baldwin's essay about how, calling out, saying that sometimes anti-Semitism happens because Jews are white. I find it a very troubling and challenging article. I have not found significant, that has not been my experience with the Black Lives Matter movement and ours in general.
You just broke up, so
sorry.
When you stop.
Am I back? All right. You guys hear me?
Why don't you repeat that response? You had broken up for the beginning of your response.
I was going to say that it's not my experience in general to have experienced that degree of overt anti-Semitism within the Black Lives Matter movement. And I have seen, my experience has been that overall the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement is pretty good about calling that out. I think the same way that for those of us who are white, we are constantly having to unpack our own internalized racism because of the ways in which the United States is structurally racist. Anti-Semitism is also something that is baked into American society. And so people may have grown up with anti-Semitic tropes that they may not have realized were anti-Semitic, or that no one has ever called them out before for using. And so that's also why the relationships are really key, because if we don't show up, we can't have those conversations about why certain things are anti-Semitic. And so, I think that is very important. And I have really seen, my experience has been that when leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement have used intentionally or unintentionally been anti-Semitic, that has been called out.
Interesting question. Can you address the argument that the Jewish community post-Holocaust should really focus on Jewish issues such as anti-Semitism or the health of the Jewish community, whatever they are, and that anti-Black racism isn't a Jewish issue exclusively at this time? That is, can you counter the idea that Jews need to fend for themselves and shouldn't need other allies, troubling as it is? The questioner has heard that Jews just need to fend for themselves. And what about the Black community? Does this transfer over?
So first of all, I would say that the Jewish community, anti-Black racism is also a Jewish issue because there are Jews who are Black, right? And it's a justice issue. If we believe that part of our job is to repair the world, and this is a major systemic issue in the society that we live in, that it's an imperative for us to say that, especially if we benefit from systemic racism, right, for those of us who are white, then once you know that you benefit from an injustice, can you knowingly continue to benefit from it? I think that in the post-Holocaust world, we see the Jewish community kind of torn between two poles, one of which is a very deep particularism that we have to care for ourselves, and a strong universalism, which I think, is kind of I often think of it as kind of at the basis of American Judaism because of, for a long time, the largest Jewish community in the United States was the Reform movement, and their idea that the Jewish community existed to be a light unto the nations, right? And so that part of our role and the idea of prophetic Judaism, and we see a very strong justice tradition in the prophets. So that for me is really important. I mean, there's like, many in the Jewish community are moral, modern people, and part of that more liberal stance is to care about justice and to care about about the problems that are society. To go back to the text that I started with, that when the people are in pain, you cannot sit at home. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be. And then I don't think that those issues are divorced from Jewish issues. Poverty is a Jewish issue, whether it's because there are poor people in society or because there are poor Jews. Racism is a Jewish issue because there are Jews of color, because Jews benefit from systemic racism, and because Jews are racist, right? Like, we're all unpacking our own internal racism. And so we have to deal with it as a Jewish issue because we have an obligation to pursue justice, and that means looking at the ways in which we perpetuate injustice. Obviously, I work for an organization that does work both on quote unquote Jewish issues and on universal issues, and I think both of those are part of the call of what we're called to do in this world. I see that part of the question is just talk about it without talking about it being transactional, like that if we don't show up for other people,
right,
they won't show up for us. I agree. We should do this work because it's the right thing to do. And we should be in movements because if we show up, then we can have these conversations. There may be a transactional advantage, but that's not why we do it.
Glad you caught that part of it. Some of the other questions were private for me. I'm going back through the list to make sure I covered most of them.
I would be happy to continue the conversation with anyone who'd like, so they can reach out to you if you want afterwards. I think that this is a really important moment for us to have these conversations as Jews. I certainly think that, I did a call with with sort of some of the staff of Camp Ramah, and for the people who are on college campuses, this is what they are talking about, and they're really grappling with what does it mean to be Jews, to show up in movements for justice. They are certainly living in a Jewish community that is more interracial, where they are much more, they're likely to have Jewish friends who are Jews of color, and for whom these are not separate. This is not a Jewish issue as showing up as allies. This is a Jewish issue because this is our community. And these are hard conversations to have, but I think this is the work we must do. And so I really appreciate. Someone asked, how can we speak without worrying that we'll be offensive? I think we do our best. I think we get heard when we get called out, right? So at Trua, we recently had a webinar that we meant to say, it was about art and movements for justice, and somehow we ended up titling it like movements for racial justice, which created a different set of expectations about what the call would be about, and then it made it more challenging that the only Jews who spoke on the call were white, and we got called out about it, and we went, okay, you're right. It's hard because I think there is, there may be language we don't know, things that we don't know are terms that we might don't know are offensive, but it's only by learning and by allowing ourselves to be educated that we can really do this work. It's hard, but I also think this is where it's helpful to be in relationship with people, not just with people of color, but also that we can have these conversations with our friends and say, like, okay, I said this and it didn't go well, and why, and try to think of, like, why would a term be offensive? Why would we no longer be able to say something that we felt like we used to be able to say? If we don't try, then if we don't engage, then we'll never be able to do the good work. But it sometimes means that we're not always going to do it well. And I include myself in that. I don't think I do this perfectly. None of us do.
I think we've covered most of the questions on the chat board. I'd like to just put out a couple of things I've learned from my students, if I may.
Absolutely.
So I run programs to bring more underrepresented minority students into careers in science, both at the undergraduate and graduate school level. And during this, we've had several Zooms with my students, and I've learned a couple of things from them. I think I'd like to reiterate one of the things you said, which is we have to learn. So when I call meeting, I usually say, who has something to say? You know, who'd like to say, how are you feeling at this moment? Okay, that was right after George Floyd. And then I just sat back, and sometimes I have to respect the silence. And it's not my business to prod. If somebody doesn't want to talk, then they don't want to talk. And if somebody wants to talk, then they'll talk. But I have to allow for silences. And in Jewish context, I'm usually not used to that. So that's one of the things I learned from my students. And I sometimes, going back to the question about being uncomfortable, sometimes I've said things where one of my students afterwards will send me an email and say, you know, this didn't go quite so well. And I think, as you say, you have to be willing to just learn from that and to accept it. So, you know, in terms of trying, as one of the things I say to my students, in terms of being sort of an old white guy, old upper middle class white guy running minority programs, I'm always learning, and I think I learn, I make mistakes, and I think that's part of interacting, and it's true with many other groups too. It's not only with minorities. Would it be possible to post the chat? Phil Goldwasser, is it possible to post the chat? I've never done that. Do you know? Anybody know if it's possible to post the chat? I've never, neither here nor at work have I done that. So I think the answer may be no. It may be ephemeral. Okay. So if there are no other pressing questions, again, there were some really great links that were put in the chat, and I'm sorry that those may go away. At least I don't have them. So I would personally like to thank you, Rabbi, for coming on. For me, this was very informative, and my hope is that during the course of the year. Oh, the other thing I asked, one of my black students said to me, "I'm really tired of the burden of trying to explain who I am to everybody else. There are lots of resources, and you should go out and get educated and educate yourselves." And so I think one of my hopes for this year is also that this is the first of several programs we'll be running, particularly on race and racism in America, so that we educate ourselves. And it may have to do with reading books, or it may have to do with having other speakers. So I hope this is a starting point. This is not a simple one-off package. And I think it's a very important thing for our shul and for the Jewish community. So I personally would like to thank you for coming on. I'd like to thank Udi Shore for getting the ball rolling here, wherever he is. He's not on my screen. Rabbi Malmud, any final words from you? You have to unmute yourself.
Just want to thank everyone for being here and being part of this very important conversation. And thank you, Rabbi Rachel Kahn-Troster.
Good night, everyone.